U.S. heavy cruisers 1941-45 Introduction. In the interwar period, the United States Navy USN built 18 large cruisers. These came to be known as heavy cruisers because of their size and later because of their armament. All of these ships were built under limitations resulting from a series of naval treaties, and thus they were also known as treaty cruisers. These ships gave valuable service during World War II and saw action in all the major battles in the Pacific. A separate volume will cover the heavy cruisers built during and after the war that saw service not only in 1941-45, but also later in the Korean and Vietnam conflicts. American naval strategy and the role of the heavy cruiser. The heavy cruiser was a staple in the USN during World War II. The term came into use in 1920 to distinguish it from a light cruiser in terms of size and importance. In 1931, the use of the term was clarified and applied to any cruiser with 8-inch guns. Traditionally, American cruisers were seen primarily as 5 scouting ships in support of the main battle fleet and, in addition, were tasked to counter enemy scouting forces and screen the battle fleet. Their speed and range also made them well suited as commerce raiders or for protecting shipping lanes against enemy raiders. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1920 magnified the importance of heavy cruisers. Since the treaty placed limits on the number of battleships that the USN could operate but not on heavy cruisers, the latter became a substitute for the battleship. The smaller number of battleships meant that they were less likely to be risked, especially on secondary missions. In their place, heavy cruisers were an obvious substitute. Going into the Pacific War, heavy cruisers were assigned to the Fleet Scouting Force, which reflected their primary mission. In addition to their scouting mission in support of the battle fleet, heavy cruisers were assigned as escorts to the Pacific Fleet's carriers. This was a natural fit, since the heavy cruiser had the speed and endurance to keep up with the carriers. But it was also seen as necessary to protect the carriers from Japanese cruisers or battle cruisers. The heavy cruiser also possessed a relatively heavy anti-aircraft that could help protect the carrier from air attack. At the start of the Pacific War, the importance of the cruiser was immediately elevated. The attack on Pearl Harbor reduced the strength of the USN's battle line and demonstrated that the war would not be fought between opposing battle fleets, but that carrier aviation would be dominant. The vulnerability of older USN battleships to torpedo damage was also clearly in evidence. As the carrier became the center of American naval operations, the heavy cruiser became an integral part of carrier task forces. Cruisers were the primary escorts for the carriers during the series of earlier carrier raids between February and April 1942, and during the first 2 carrier battles in the Coral Sea in May and at Midway in June. When the focus of operations in the Pacific shifted to the South Pacific, beginning in August 1942, the heavy cruiser assumed another role as the leading element of surface task forces committed to engaging the Japanese Navy at night in the waters around Guadalcanal. From August until November, there were 5 major battles against the Japanese, with American heavy cruisers being the centerpiece of the American task forces in all Butone. Against the well-drilled Japanese, who had spent considerable time and resources developing and practicing night fighting doctrine and equipment, the American heavy cruisers suffered severely. The extent of the carnage is shown by the fact that of the 14 heavy cruisers active during the campaign for Guadalcanal, 5 were sunk and another 7 damaged. After the struggle for Guadalcanal concluded with an American victory in February 1943, USN heavy cruisers continued to take a prominent role in the advance to Japan. Given additional anti-aircraft weaponry, they continued to perform admirably as carrier escorts. They showed their versatility as they were employed in a number of roles, including shore bombardment and engaging Japanese surface units when the opportunity was presented. Heavy cruisers also were active in the European theater in convoy escort and shore bombardment roles. By the end of the war, 7 of the 18 treaty heavy cruisers had been sunk, but victory had been secured. USN heavy cruiser design and impact of Washington and London naval treaties coming out of World War I, the USN planned a massive expansion. Part of this would be the construction of a large number of cruisers to screen the battle line and the battle cruiser force, and to form forces dedicated to scouting and providing protection from enemy scouting forces. The most likely opponent was judged to be the Japanese, but the USN was also driven to gain parity with the Royal Navy. Originally, the cruiser designed to fill these needs was based on the Omaha-class scout cruiser, a 7,100 T ship armed with 12 6-inch guns and a top speed of 35 knots. This changed with the ratification of the Washington Naval Treaty in February 1922. Because it thought a larger cruiser was required for the 7 expanses of the Pacific, the USN was happy with the limitations on cruisers contained in the treaty, which were set at 10,000 T with a gun no greater than 8 inches. While there were limits on individual ships, there was no limit set on the overall tonnage or number of cruisers that each power could build. For the USN, the upper limit of cruiser size became the standard design size for all. Since the Americans did not want to build ships with inferior armament to foreign contemporaries, 8-inch main batteries also became the norm. Since the treaty set limits on battleship tonnage for the world's 5 principal navies, and none was set for cruisers, a cruiser building spree quickly ensued. In late 1922, the USN planned to finish the construction of 10 planned Omaha-class cruisers and 16 new 8-inch cruisers. However, Congress was reluctant to fund what it saw as excessive requests and, during the interwar period, the USN was tardy building up to its allowed limits. With evidence of Japanese heavy cruiser construction, Congress approved 8 cruisers in late 1924, but funded only 2. The other 6 were not funded until 1926 and 1927. The first American heavy cruiser designs under the Washington Treaty favored firepower and speed over protection. The first generation of treaty cruisers were called tinclads because of their sparse armor. These ships off the Pensacola and Northampton classes were well under the 10,000 treaty limitation, and therefore were not well-balanced designs. After a transitional design of the 2 ships of the Portland class, American designers hit their stride with the much more successful New Orleans class. These decisive ships were well protected and maintained a high speed and powerful main and secondary batteries. Since the Washington Naval Treaty imposed no limit on the numbers of cruisers that could be built, the primary goal of the London Naval Conference, opened in January 1930, was to place a cap on cruiser construction. With the Americans and British open to this notion, negotiations signed an agreement to create 2 different types of cruisers and to limit the tonnage for each. Type E cruisers were those armed with guns of 6.1 in or more heavy cruisers, and the maximum 10,000 T limit from the Washington Naval Treaty remained in place. The USN was allotted 180,000 tough type of cruisers, which is still translated into 18 10,000 T ships. The Americans agreed not to build to their 18-ship limit immediately. Assuming 15 cruisers were completed by 1935, the USN was not allowed to start construction on the 16th ship until 1933, being commissioned in 1936, with the final 2 ships begun at yearly intervals after that. This affected the construction of the last 2 units of the New Orleans class and the unique Wichita, which was the 18th and last treaty heavy cruiser built. The system of naval treaties in place between the wars meant that all 18 U.S. and heavy cruisers built during this period were designed with a series of compromise in mind. It was only after the expiration of these treaties that a heavy cruiser was designed that could fully incorporate the competing requirements of firepower, speed, and protection. U.S. and heavy cruiser weapons. The 8-inch gun was accepted without debate as the primary heavy cruiser weapon. It had a longer range than the 6-inch gun mounted on existing American and British large cruisers, so it was assumed that any 8-inch gun-armed ship would possess an advantage. The 8-inch gun also possessed greater striking power against heavily armored targets. Conversely, the 6-inch had a much greater rate of fire, but in the end the greater range of the 8-inch gun prevailed. During the Guadalcanal campaign, the 8-inch gun was preferred because of its greater penetrative power against Japanese heavy cruisers or battleships. Later, in the Solomons campaign, as primary opponent became Japanese destroyers, the heavy cruiser lost favor opposed to light cruisers with faster firing 6-inch guns. The older Mk9 and 14 guns equipped the Pensacola, Northampton, and Portland classes, and some ships of the New Orleans class. The muck-lighter Mk-12 gun was fitted on for ships of the New Orleans class Tuscaloosa, San Francisco, Quincy, and Vincennes, and the Unicoi Wichita. These developed a lower muzzle velocity and consequently a shorter range. Minneapolis carried the Mk-15 gun. American 8-inch turret suffered from a dispersion of shot problem. This problem was not self-evident, the gun barrels were separated more, but this was not done until the new turret design on Wichita. U.S. and heavy cruisers generated fire control information from two fire control directors. One was mounted forward on the bridge superstructure and the other on the aft superstructure. American fire control equipment was of a high standard and was superior to the IJN's. Originally, the Mk-18 director was fitted on the Pensacola class, the Mk-24 on the Northampton class, and the Mk-27 on the Portland class. These were replaced by the Mk-35, Mk-31, and Mk-34 respectively. Wichita was 9 completed with the Mk-34 director, and this system was refitted on several cruisers during the war. Beginning in 1942, existing directors were fitted with dedicated radar, which greatly increased their accuracy and provided a blind fire capability and the opportunity to engage targets at night. And like Japanese heavy cruisers, which were designed with a substantial torque armament, the USN considered its heavy cruisers to be primarily gun platforms. Originally, the Pensacola and Northampton classes carried two triple banks of 2-1 in torpedoes, but by 1935 the U.S. Navy had decided to remove torpedoes from its heavy cruisers. The thinking was that actions would be fought at ranges that would never allow cruisers to use their torpedoes. This turned out to be a questionable decision in light of the short-range actions fought at night against the Japanese in 1942. But it probably did not matter given the poor performance and reliability of American torpedoes. During that time, American cruisers began the war with a respectable level of anti-aircraft rotation by virtue of their secondary battery of 8 medium-range 5-inch 25 weapons. This gun had a short barrel, which reduced range and accuracy, but it excelled in rate of fire. In the anti-aircraft role, it could hurl a 54-pound shell up to 27,400 feet. A well-drilled crew could fire 14 rounds per minute. Only Wichita received the even better 5-inch 38 gun, which was generally considered to be the best dual-purpose naval weapon of the war. U.S. and heavy cruisers were deficient in short and medium-range anti-aircraft weapons at the start of the war. The 8.50 cal machine guns fitted were intended to defeat dive bomber attack, but were clearly insufficient for this purpose. This was identified before the war, and the USN was already in the process of upgrading anti-aircraft protection for its cruisers before the war began. It was intended to place for 1.1 in quad mounts on each cruiser and to replace the machine guns with 20mm single mounts. However, production shortages prevented this from being released until early 1942. In any event, the 1.1 in mount proved to be unreliable and lacked range. Beginning in 1943, these were replaced with the 40mm Bofors gun, usually in quad mounts but also in twin mounts when top weight issues prevented a quad mount from being used. The 40mm quad mount was the iconic USN anti-aircraft weapon of the war and proved very effective in service. Fire control was provided by the Mk-51 director, and the weapon proved effective to about 3,000 yards. The standard short-range anti-aircraft weapon aboard U.S. and heavy cruisers from 1942 was the Swiss-designed 20mm Oerlikon gun. This weapon was air-cooled, required no external power source, and was comparatively quick, so could be fitted in relatively large numbers aboard cruisers. It was originally fitted as only a single mount, but late in the war a twin mount was provided to increase firepower. The 20mm was a last-ditch weapon, effective only to about 1,500 yards. Late in the war, it was replaced whenever possible by the heavier 40mm gun, since its small shell lacked the punch to knock down kamikazes. U.S. and heavy cruiser radar widespread and early provision of radar gave U.S. and cruisers a critical advantage against the Japanese in both surface gunnery engagements and in detecting and engaging aerial targets. The first radar fitted aboard heavy cruisers was the experimental CXAM radar, which had a large mattress antenna usually mounted on the foremast. This set had a theoretical maximum detection range of 16 nanometers against large surface targets and 70 nanometers against a large aircraft at 10,000 feet. It was fitted aboard Pensacola, Northampton, Chester, and Chicago. In 1942, this sea radar was produced in sufficient quantity to equip all cruisers. This was a device that tried to match the CXAM's electronics with a smaller antenna, but was not a success, and the radar was frequently outperformed by Japanese optics in surface engagements in the Solomons camping. The SC-1 improved set quickly appeared, which had twice the power and roughly twice the range. This translated to approximately 20 nm for a large surface target and 60 nanometers on a large aircraft. The SC-1 was replaced by the much more powerful SK air search radar. This became the standard cruiser air search radar and could detect a larger target at up to 100 nanometers flying at 10,000 feet. It was usually mounted at the top off foremast. Late in the war, as cruisers underwent air defense modernization, several were fitted with the SP radar. This radar had only a 50 nanometers maximum range against a large, high-flying target, but it did provide fairly accurate elevation accuracy. It was thus critical for guiding fighters against kamikazes. The mainstay surface search radar for cruisers was the SG radar. This was the first microwave radar to incorporate a display, which made interpretation easier. The first production model appeared on Augusta in April 1942, and the improved SG-1 entered service in May 1943. The SG radar was placed first on the top of the foremast and then a second set on the mainmast. Two sets gave 360-degree coverage. Theoretical maximum range was 22 nanometers against a large surface target. In addition to air and surface search radar, heavy cruisers were fitted with dedicated fire control radars. For example, the most modern fire control director, the Mk-34, first received the Mk-3 radar. Mid-war, the Mk-8 was fitted, which had a reliable range of 40,000 yards against a large surface target. This was replaced by Mk-13. The Mk-33 director for the 5" battery was first equipped with the Mk-4, which was very successful, and then later the M28 radar. 1 Pensacola class design and construction. Pensacola class was begun after other contemporary treaty cruisers, but overall the design did not compare well with other foreign rivals. The primary design consideration was to mount a heavy armament, and this had to match Japanese ships, which were known to carry 10 8" guns. Unlike Japanese heavy cruisers, which carried their 10 8" guns in 5 turrets, the Pensacola class matched this on only 4 turrets. This avoided the problem of having a turret with a much reduced arc of fire, and meant that the hull could be shorter, which was a significant weight-saving measure. Because the ship had to fit within treaty limitations, saving weight was a primary design factor. Another weight-saving measure was to provide less protection and less powerful machinery. This meant that the Pensacola class was not as well armored and had a slightly slower maximum speed than the Japan's first-generation treaty cruisers of the Miyako class. Another weight-saving feature was a flush deck hull and a low freeboard. The designers relied on a pronounced flare and shear to keep the ships dry. Their 2 tripod masts and large fighting tops gave them a top-heavy appearance. In fact, they were top-heavy and prone to roll heavily even in moderate seas. This roll affected the fire control equipment and thus gunnery accuracy. For their scouting role, speed was another important consideration. 2 widely spaced stacks were fitted. The machinery developed a total of 107 OO shaft horsepower SHP and consisted of 8 boilers connected to Frigera turbines, which drove 4 shafts. Maximum speed was a respectable 30.5 knots. Every treaty cruiser design struggled to combine a balance of firepower, speed, and protection. For the Pensacola class, the first 2 were achieved at the expense of the latter. Protection accounted for only 6% of the total design weight, giving a clear indication that armor was relatively sparse. The main belt was only 3 inches thick over the machinery spaces and 4 inches over forward magazines, with the belt extending 5 feet below the waterline. No armor covered the aft magazine because it was bizarrely assumed that any action would occur forward of the beam. The main armored deck was 1 inch and augmented to 1.75 in over the magazines. The 8-in mounts were more gun houses than armored turrets with 2.5 in of frontal armor, 1.5 inches on the sides, and 0.75 inches on the rear. Turret barbettes received only 0.75 in. The conning tower was protected by 1.25 in of armor. In comparison, the Aegean's first-generation treaty cruiser had just over 16% of displacement dedicated to protection. Since heavy cruisers were thought to be primarily scouting platforms, it was deemed very important to carry aircraft. On the Pensacola class, 2 catapults were fitted port and starboard just aft of the forward stack. In the space between the 2 stacks, 4 aircraft could be stored. No hangar was provided. Like the Japanese, who continually underestimated the weight of the treaty cruisers, took no corrective actions, and therefore produced ships well over 10,000 t. The American designers were so successful in saving weight that Pensacola's came in at only 910 t. All considered, however, this was not a successful design and was inferior to the first-generation Japanese treaty heavy cruisers. The USN admitted as much by only building only 2 ships before moving to an improved design. Armament. The Pensacola class featured an unusual 10-gun main battery arrangement, in which a pair of twin and triple mounts were fitted forward and aft. The heavier triple mount was placed in a super firing position over the twin mount, placing the triple mounts this high on the ship, necessary because the barbette of the triple mounts could not be placed on the sleek hull, contributed to the top-heavy problem of the class. This made the Pensacola class the only class of USN heavy cruiser to carry 10 8-inch guns. The Pensacola class was fitted with 2 triple torpedo mounts placed on the upper deck abreast the aft stack. The secondary armament was restricted to for 5 inches, 25 single mounts. A battery of 8 5-inch guns was deemed necessary for effective anti-aircraft protection, but only 4 mounts were fitted to save weight. Light anti-aircraft weaponry was restricted to machine guns. Service modifications. For the war, both ships received major modifications. By 1935, the torpedo mounts were removed from both ships. In their place, 4 additional 5-inch 25 single mounts were added abreast the bridge structure. Also just before Thur, 1.1 in quad mounts began to enter service, and each ship received 2. After the war began, all heavy cruisers received modifications focused on improving their anti-aircraft and radar fits. To compensate for this, measures were also taken to reduce top weight. In 1942, anti-aircraft fit was increased to for 1.1 in quads and 8 single 20mm guns. By 1943, the 1.1 in mounts were replaced by the more reliable and powerful quad 40mm mounts, and additional 20mm single mounts were added. To compensate, the mainmast was removed, the aircraft complement was reduced to 2, and the starboard catapult was detached. In 1945, Pensacola was thoroughly modernized and received a final fit of 7 quad 40mm mounts and 9 twin 20mm mounts. Salt Lake City's final fit in 1945 was 6 quad 40mm and 19 single 20mm mounts. Pensacola was one of the first ships to receive the CXAM radar in 1940. By the end of the war, both ships were fitted with an SK radar, 2 STs, and SP aircraft control radar. Wartime service. Despite the design deficiencies of these ships, both were employed actively and enjoyed successful careers. When war broke out in the Pacific, Pensacola was escorting a convoy to the Philippines. She quickly returned to Pearl Harbor and was assigned to escort carrier Lexington, and saw her first action in an abortive raid on Rabaul on February 20, 1942. In March, she participated in the carrier raids on Lae and Samoa and New Guinea. In June, Pensacola participated in the Battle of Midway as part of Carrier Enterprise Screen. The cruiser was shifted to screen carrier Yorktown and engaged Japanese torpedo aircraft when they attacked the damaged carrier. Pensacola remained on carrier duty and, in October 1942, escorted carrier Hornet at the Battle of Santa Cruz. Hornet was sunk, but Pensacola wasn't damaged. The following month, Pensacola was again assigned to escort Enterprise as the Americans turned back the last major Japanese effort to capture Guadalcanal in the Solomons. In late November, Pensacola and 3 other heavy cruisers were given mission to prevent Japanese resupply to Guadalcanal. On the night of November 29th to 30th, the U.S. force engaged a Japanese destroyer 4C attempting to land supplies. The resulting action, known as the Battle of Tassafaronga, was the most dramatic demonstration of the power of the Japanese Type 93 torpedo during the war. All 4 of the American heavy cruisers present were torpedoed. A single weapon hit Pensacola on the port side below the mainmast and caused major damage. With 1 engine room flooded, much of the ship lost power, but the primary damage was caused by a fire that raged until noon the following day. The crew saved the ship, but casualties were very heavy, with 125 killed and another 68 wounded. Repairs kept the cruiser out of the war for a year. When she returned to service in November 1943, she was again assigned to carrier duty. Pensacola took part in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns. From May to early August, Pensacola was active in the waters of the northern Pacific, shelling targets on the Kuril Islands. Returning to carrier duty, she pounded targets in Wake and Marcus Islands. Pensacola was part of the 3rd Fleet through the Philippines campaign. In February 1945, Pensacola took part in softening operations against Iwo Jima. On February 17th, the cruiser took 6 hits from Japanese shore of Pensacola class. The top view shows Pensacola in her early war configuration as she appeared at Midway in June 1942. Clearly visible are the 4 8-inch gun houses, making this the only class to carry its main armament in this arrangement. The 5-inch battery is situated in 2 groups, one near the forward superstruck and the other abaft the aft stack. Note the significant allocation of space amidships for the aircraft handling facilities. The ship carries a CXAM radar on the foremast. Pensacola is in Measure M's 21 Navy Blue System scheme. This was an anti-aircraft concealment scheme introduced in 1942 and used until the end of the war. The use of solid colors, in this case navy blue and deck blue, was designed to reduce the ship's observability from the air. The 2nd and 3rd views are of Salt Lake City, showing her 1944 appearance. The ship's main and secondary armament remains unchanged, but almost everything else has been altered. Both the forward and aft superstructures have been reduced to save top weight. An SK radar is fitted on top of the leeward foremast, and ASP radar on the new polmast aft. There is also a profusion of anti-aircraft guns with 6 40mm quad mounts and 19 20mm single guns being visible. The ship is in Striking's 30 to 14th dazzle scheme. The 2 basic types of camouflage measures were solid like M's 21 and dazzle. A dazzle camouflage was intended to provide anti-submarine protection by causing target angle confusion at close ranges. M232 was regarded as the best of the anti-submarine schemes. 16 batteries that killed 17 and wounded 119. Beginning in late March until April 15, Pensacola supported the invasion of Okinawa by providing gun for support. Her war service earned 13 battle stars. After the war, it was decided to use Pensacola in a series of atomic bomb tests in 1946. In the first test on July 1st, the ship was heavily damaged but did not sink. A second test conducted on July 25th caused further damage, but the ship survived. After radiological studies on the ship, she was sunk as a target off the coast of Washington on November 10, 1948. The start of the war found Salt Lake City assigned to the Enterprise Task Group. She accompanied Enterprise in the Marshall's raid in February 1942, during which the cruiser conducted shore bombardments and fought off Japanese air attack. In April, she participated in the Doolittle raid against the Japanese home islands. In August, Salt Lake City began operations in support of the landings on Guadalcanal. In October, the Americans decided to contest the night waters around the island following the defeat at Savo Island in August. On the night of October 11th to 12th, Salt Lake City was part of an American task force of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers that engaged a smaller Japanese force intent on shelling the key airfield on the island, which was held by the Americans. In the Battle of Cape Esperance, the Americans sank a Japanese heavy cruiser and a destroyer, while losing only one destroyer. Salt Lake City was hit by 3 8-inch shells in the fray, which penetrated her main belt and suffered 5 killed. The damage required 6 months to repair. Upon returning to service in March 1943, Salt Lake City headed north to patrol the Aleutians. On March 27th, at the Battle of the Commodore-Schizls, Salt Lake City fought one of the epic cruiser battles of the war. An American force of 1 heavy and 1 old light cruiser and 4 destroyers 17 intercepted a larger Japanese force of 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers, which was escorting a supply convoy to Japanese Hellas lands in the Aleutians. For over 3 hours, the Salt Lake City engaged several more powerful Japanese heavy cruisers. She fired 832 8-inch rounds and in return took at least 2 hits, which caused flooding and a temporary loss of ore. Just as it seemed that the Japanese would close for the kill, they broke off the action. The action was a tactical defeat, but a strategic victory since the supply convoy did not reach its destination. After repairs, Salt Lake City joined Pensacola on carrier escort duty and participated in the same actions as her sister ship. For her war service she was awarded 11 battle stars and an American Navy Unit Commendation for Herald in the Battle of the Commodore-Schizls. She was also selected as an atomic test target and survived both tests. The cruiser was sunk as a target off California on May 25, 1948. Northampton-class design and construction. This work in what was to become the Northampton-class began immediately after the Pensacola design was finalized. For the second class of Houston Treaty cruiser, the designers intended to incorporate a number of improvements in the areas of seaworthiness, survivability, and aircraft handling arrangements. The 6 ships in the class were authorized in 1924, but not funded until 1927, and were finally laid down in 1928. The new class was provided with a raised forecastle and increased freeboard. The added length, some 14 feet, also improved seakeeping. Nevertheless, excessive rolling was still a problem and bilged keels were fitted. The ships still remained lively in any kind of sea, and this affected gunnery accuracy. It was becoming apparent to the USN that the Pensacola class came in underweight. The obvious answer was to use this margin to provide extra armor to increase the inadequate level of protection for the Northampton class. The ideal protection scheme would have provided protection against 188-inch shell fire from opposing enemy cruisers, but this was impossible on a 10 OOT ship. After several schemes were considered, it was decided to improve the splinter protection to the magazine up to the turrets and keep the remainder of the extra weight as a design reserve. In spite of this, the final design came in at almost 1,000 T under the treaty limit. Protection amounted to only 3 inches of armor in the main belt, extending 5 feet below the waterline. Deck armor was 1 inch thick. Magazine protection was increased to 3.75 inches on the side and 2 inches overhead. The aiding gun houses had to 0.5 inches on the front plate and 2 inches on the roof. Total weight of armor was 1,057 T. Compartmentation was improved with the 2 large boiler rooms being divided into 4 smaller rooms. The same machinery was fitted as on the Pensacola class, and top speed remained at 30.5 knots. Aircraft facilities were much improved with a hangar being built in theory of the aft stack that could accommodate 4 aircraft. The large hangar meant that aircraft were no longer stored and worked on in the open and they gained some measure of blast protection from the ship's main armament. Another 2 aircraft could be stored on the 2 catapults, but in practice only 4 aircraft were carried. The 6 ships were all envisioned as flagships. The last 3 ships had their forecastle deck extended aft near the catapults, which allowed for extra accommodation spaces and suitability as a fleet flagship. The other 3 ships were intended to be used as squadron flagships. The Northampton class. The top 2 profiles show an early war Northampton-class ship, in this case the lead ship of the class, Northampton. This is how the ship appeared during the Battle of Midway. The primary differences between Northampton and the earlier Pensacola class are the presence of only 3 8-inch gun houses and the more compact placement of the 5 inches battery. Northampton carries DEXIM-1 radar on her foremast. The ship is in the MiS-21 scheme. Louisville bottom profile presents a much different appearance in this October 1940 review, as she appeared during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The forward superstructure has been reduced, and an SK radar is fitted on the foremast. The mainmast has been entirely removed, and a new lattice mast built around the aft stack. The modified area aft now contains many single 20mm mounts. Note the heavy 40mm armament with for quad and for twin mounts. The ship is in the MiS-32, a 60 skimmer 10-gun main battery of the Pensacola class was not repeated. During the design phase, there was considerable debate whether to adopt an 8-gun arrangement as on European heavy cruisers or to move to a 9-gun arrangement with 3 triple turrets. The triple turret arrangement was adopted, which allowed the hull to be shorter, with only 3 turrets as opposed to 4. This adoption of a 9-gun mine battery proved successful and was the preferred arrangement for every other U.S. and heavy cruiser ever built. Otherwise, the armament was the same as the Pensacola class, with an identical torpedo battery and an inadequate secondary battery of 5 inches 25 guns. The only light weapons were a few .50 cal machine guns. Service modifications as on the Pensacola class ships. The torpedo tubes were removed by 1935, and before the war an additional for single 5 inches 25 guns were fitted. Because of the shortage of the new 1.1 quad mount, for 3 inches, 50 single guns were substituted instead. The mounts were fitted in pairs, one abreast bridge and the other between the 2 groups of 5 inches 25 guns. When she was lost, Houston may have had 3 and 50 guns and a single 1.1 quadruple mount. The shortage of guns meant that there was no standard fit for the 6 Northampton-class ships. The 8 Browning .5 and the 50 machine guns fitted in 1933 were replaced as soon as possible after the start of fewer with 20mm guns. The table shows the typical progression in enhancing the anti-aircraft fit. In 1942, the 3 inches 50 single mounts were replaced with for 1.1 quad mounts and the machine guns were replaced with 20mm single guns. This was the basic configuration that Northampton, Chicago, and Houston exhibited when they were lost. In 1943, the 40mm quad mounts replaced the 1.1 mounts and the number of 20mm guns was increased. As the air threat increased in form of kamikazes, the final aircraft fit was further increased to for quad and to twin 40mm mounts, and up to 13 twin 20mm mounts. For the 3 surviving ships, their appearance was changed by reducing the size of the aft superstructure to decrease top weight. By 1945, Chester had her large foremast removed and replaced by a polemast for the SK radar. Her mainmast aft was also removed and replaced by a tripod mast built around the aft stack, which was used to place an SP radar. By 1945, Louisville had a half-mast forward and a new lattice mast aft. The original mainmast was removed. Augusta also exhibited a similar late war appearance with a new lattice mast aft. All ships had the lower deck portholes welded over and the top of the stack modified to keep smoke away from the bridge. One catapult was also removed to save top weight wartime service as 6 ships of the Northampton class gave tremendous service in a variety of roles. 3 of the ships were sunk, 2 solely by torpedoes, and another was struck by a torpedo and survived. Northampton began the war assigned to the Enterprise Task Group and stayed with the carrier for most of her wartime career. The heavy cruiser bombarded Watch Island on February 1 and Wake Island on February 24, 1942. In April, she participated in the Doolittle raid. The cruiser remained with Enterprise at the Battle of Midway. Assigned to escort carrier Hornet at Santa Cruz, the cruiser unsuccessfully tried to tow the crippled carrier to safety. Shelliter rejoined the screen of Enterprise in November. Northampton was off for U.S. and heavy cruisers torpedoed at Tassafaronga on November 30th, but was the only one to sink. Northampton took 2 torpedoes on her port side and sank within 3 hours from uncontrolled flooding. Casualties include 49 killed and 29 wounded. For her wartime service, the ship was awarded 6 battle stars. Chester also began the war as part of the Enterprise Task Group. On the February raid in the Marshalls, Chester shelled targets on Truro Island but was hit by a Japanese aircraft bomb that killed 8 crew members. She was present at Coral Sea, but missed midway while in overhaul. Shortly after arriving in the South Pacific, the cruiser was torpedoed on October 20th by Japanese submarine I-176 southeast of Guadalcanal. A single torpedo hit on starboard side amidships, causing heavy damage and killing 11. The cruiser survived, but missed a year of the war. Returning to service, Chester took part in the invasion of the Marshalls. In June, she shelled targets in Thecriles and then joined the Third Fleet for the invasion of the Philippines. She was present for the invasion of Iwo Jima in early 1945, but missed the Okinawa campaign as she was in overhaul. The ship was placed in reserve in July 1946 and sold for scrap in August 1959. For her wartime service, the ship was awarded 11 battle stars. For her sustained service during the war, Louisville earned 13 battle stars. Her first action came when she escorted Yorktown in the February 1942 raids against the Gilberts and Marshalls. She missed the Battle of Midway because she was assigned as part of the force to defend the Aleutians. She missed almost all of the Guadalcanal campaign, but joined at the end of the struggle to participate in the Battle off Rental Island, during which Chickamauga sunk. She was struck by an air-launched torpedo during this engagement, but it failed to detonate. This made Louisville one of only 2 treaty heavy cruisers to be involved in the Guadalcanal campaign and not sunk or damaged. For most of the remainder of 1943, the cruiser was active in the waters off the Aleutians and participated in the invasions of Kiska and Attu. In 1944, her principal actions included the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Light Gulf. At Light Gulf, she was one of the units present at the Battle of the Surigao Strait, which was the last major surface battle of the war and the last battle ever between battleships. The ship suffered in 1945. During the invasion of Luzon, the ship was hit by 2 kamikaze aircraft on January 6, which killed 32 and wounded 56. On June 5, off Okinawa, the ship was again struck by a kamikaze and this time suffered 1 dead and 59 wounded. The cruiser was placed in reserve in June 1946 and sold for scrap in 1959. Chicago had a relatively short wartime career. When the war began, she was part of the Lexington Task Group. She accompanied the carrier to the South Pacific and took part in the carrier raids in March and the Battle of Thecriles Sea in May. During that engagement, she was detached from the carriers and was subjected to air attack and suffered minor strafing damage. She remained in the South Pacific and took part in the initial landing on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. 2 days later, the Japanese reacted to the invasion by dispatching a cruiser group to attack the landing force. The first large ship they encountered was Chicago. In a brief fight, 1 Japanese torpedo hit the cruiser on her bow, which forced the ship out of the fight and killed 2 and wounded 21. The cruiser was forced to retreat to the U.S. for repairs and did not return to action until January 1943. Upon her arrival, Chicago was assigned to patrol southeast of Guadalcanal in expectation of another Japanese operation to send reinforcements to the island. On the night of January 29, Chicago's group came under Japanese air attack. In a well-executed attack, 2 torpedoes struck the cruiser and she was brought to a stop. The next day, Japanese torpedo aircraft finished off the cruiser with another 4 hits. Chicago earned 3 battle stars. The ship in the class with the shortest wartime career was Houston. In November 1940, she became the flagship of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet based in the Philippines. She was still in the Far East when the war opened, and became part of an Allied fleet tasked with defending the Dutch East Indies from invasion. This was a near-hopeless task against overwhelming odds. On February 4th, Houston was subjected to a bombing attack that hit the cruiser aft, knocking out the F-8 in gunhouse and killing over 50 crewmen. On February 27th, the Allied task force, including Houston, attempted to intercept a Japanese invasion force headed to Java. The resulting battle off Java Sea saw the Allied task group defeated by a force led by 2 Japanese heavy cruisers. On the afternoon of February 28th, They lied to 5 remnants left Batavia to reach Australia by the Sunda Strait. That evening, Houston and an Australian light cruiser were spotted by the Japanese in the Sunda Strait and engaged by a superior force led by 2 heavy cruisers. Houston was sunk in the early morning hours of March 1st, and of her crew over 700 died and fewer than 300 survived to face the ordeal of Japanese prison camps. For her wartime service, Houston was awarded 2 battle stars and the Presidential Unit Citation for her heroic action in Java Sea. The wartime history of Augusta began before the attack on Pearl Harbor. As flagship of the Asiatic Fleet, she was caught in Shanghai in August 1937 and mistakenly bombed by Chinese aircraft and then hit by a Japanese shell from shore, which killed 1 crewman and wounded several. In August the following year, while assigned to the Atlantic Fleet, the cruiser took President Roosevelt to meet Prime Minister Churchill at Placentia Bay in Newfoundland for the Atlantic Charter meeting. When the U.S. entered the war, Augusta spent her entire career in the European theater, including the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, the invasion of Normandy in June 1944, and the invasion of southern France in August. When President Truman went to the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, he arrived in Europe aboard Augusta. The cruiser was placed in reserve in July 1946 and scrapped in 1959. The ship earned 3 battle stars for her wartime service. Portland-class design and construction. Because the design of the next class of treaty cruiser was begun before the ships of the preceding class were even running trials, the extent to which the first 2 classes were underweight was not immediately understood. When this finally sank in, much criticism was leveled against the Pensacola's and Northamptons for being underprotected. They picked up the nickname of tinclads as a result. With as much as 1,000 t to work with, the designers of the next generation of treaty cruisers were determined to come up with a better balanced design. The desire to modify the design was upset by the existing authorization on funding scheme. In 1929, 15 additional heavy cruisers had been authorized and were planned to be built in 3 groups of 5 for the years 261,929 through 1931. The first group was intended to be a repeat of the previous Northampton class, but criticism of the design prompted a move to recast it. Because of contractual issues, this could be done only with the 3 ships planned to be built in Navy yards. The other 2 ships were contracted out to private builders. To recast their design at this late stage would have been exorbitantly expensive. The result was a 2-ship class built to a hybrid design combining features of the first generation of treaty cruisers with the upgrades of the planet's second generation. The layout of the ship was largely identical to the Northampton class. The ships were 10 feet longer, and the major difference in appearance was a shortened foremast and a much smaller mainmast aft. This reduced top heaviness and therefore contributed to stability. Machinery was identical, with the exception of replacing the White Forster boilers with others designed by Yarrow. The design did make improvements in protection. The extra weight was converted to armor and the main belt was increased to 5.75 in over the magazines, while remaining 3 inches over the machinery. The armor on top of magazines was slightly increased to 2.1 to 5 inches. The deck armor was increased from a paltry 1 inch on the Northampton class to 2.5 inches. As with the final 3 ships of the Northampton class, both ships of the Portland class were fitted to act as fleet flagships. USS Houston at the Battle of Sunda Strait. In the aftermath of the Battle of Java Sea, during which the Allied force was routed, Houston and Australian light cruiser Perth departed Batavia on Java and headed west for the Sunda Strait. Their cruisers stumbled upon a Japanese invasion convoy, landing troops on West Java late on February 28. The escorting Japanese warships were caught off guard, but soon a force of 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers gathered for the kill. A wild melee ensued, during which the Japanese torpedoed some of their own transports lying off Java. Of the 87 torpedoes fired by the Japanese, an estimated 3 found Houston. The cruiser was also pummeled by a large number of shells and sank in the early hours of March 1 with heavy loss of life. The scene shows the height of the action, With Houston firing her forward main guns, the aft turret was previously knocked out while the Japanese barrage all around her intensifies. Though at night, the basic outline of an earlier Northampton-class cruiser is evident with 3 8-inch gun houses and 2 large masts. The ship is wearing M1 dark gray scheme, which was a general-purpose measure designed to reduce the observation from ships and aircraft. Armament: the same main battery was used on the Portland class. The torpedo tubes were deleted from the design and were not aboard the ships when they were completed. The standard 4-gun 5-inch 25 secondary battery was increased tow guns when completed. Service modifications modified early in the war centered around strengthening the ship's anti-aircraft defenses. In early 1942, 4 quadruple 1.1 in mounts were fitted, as well as 12 single 20mm guns on Indianapolis and 17 on Portland. In May 1943, both ships underwent further modification. The 1.1 in mounts were replaced by 40mm quad mounts. By 1944, Portland had 4 quad and 4 twin 40mm mounts and 17 20mm guns. Indianapolis had 6 quadruple mounts and 19 20mm single mounts. The appearance of the ships also changed when, in 1943, the front of the bridge was extended, the size of the aft superstructure reduced, and a lattice tetrapod mast was built around the aft stack. In an attempt to reduce top weight, the starboard catapult was removed in both ships. Aircraft capacity was reduced to 2 on Portland and 3 on Indianapolis. In May 1944, Indianapolis emerged from an overhaul with 4 quad 40-man to twin 40mm mounts, 19 single 20mm, and an SK radar and a new mast built around the aft stack, which was unique to this ship. Indianapolis under a final modernization in mid-July 1945. When the cruiser was sunk the same year, she was carrying 6 14 quad mounts and 8 twin 20mm mounts. Wartime service: both these ships had active careers, all of which were spent in the Pacific. Indianapolis achieved a certain degree of notoriety by being the last major American ship sunk during the war. Portland began the war assigned to the Lexington Task Group and remained with the carrier up until Coral Sea. At Midway, she was assigned to escort Yorktown. Going into the Guadalcanal campaign, Portland remained on carrier duty and participated in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August as part of the Enterprise Task Group. During the second carrier battle of the campaign at Santa Cruz in October, Portland remained with Enterprise. The following month, Portland was committed to the desperate surface battles around Guadalcanal. She played an important role in the first naval battle of Guadalcanal on the night of November 12 to 13th. As one of 2 American heavy cruisers present, she selected Japanese battleship High for treatment and pummeled her with 8-inch gunfire. Minutes later, a Japanese destroyer gained a torpedo solution against Portland and struck her with a single torpedo aft, which destroyed the 2 starboard shafts and jammed their rudder in a starboard turn. The next morning the crippled cruiser was still circling, but she was able to engage the destroyer responsible for torpedoing her and sank her with 6 8-inch salvos. Portland returned to the United States for repairs that took until March 1943. Upon her return she joined the fast carrier force and took part in the invasion of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands in late 1943 and the landing at Hollandia, New Guinea, in early 1944. In September 1944, she supported landings on Peleliu and, in October, was present at the Battle of Surrey Strait. Into 1945, the cruiser participated in the invasion of Luzon, and then the invasion of Okinawa. At the conclusion of the war, she was assessed as the flagship for the American forces, accepting the surrender of Japanese forces at Truk Atoll in Central Pacific. Her extensive wartime service earned her 16 battle stars and a Navy unit commendation. The cruiser was placed into reserve in 1946 and scrapped in 1959. The opening of hostilities from Indianapolis escorting carriers. Her early war career was unusual for a Pacific Fleet cruiser in that she did not take part in Coral Sea, Midway, or the Guadalcanal campaign. After Arafat, she rejoined the fleet in July 1942 and spent most of her time in the Aleutians until the summer of 1943, when she was again sent in to refit. When she was returned to service, she was assigned as the flagship of the Fifth Fleet. In this capacity, she participated in the invasions of the Gilberts and Marshalls and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. After another refit beginning in October 1944, the ship returned for the invasion of Iwo Jima and was preparing for the landing on Okinawa when she was struck by a single kamikaze on March 31, 1945. 9 men were killed, and the damage was severe enough to force a return to the United States for hull repairs. This meant that, when repairs were completed in July, she was assigned to carry the uranium core of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima to Tainan and Marianas. This was accomplished in record time, 5,000 nanometers in 10 days, but when the ship was ordered to light, she encountered Japanese submarine E-58, which slammed two torpedoes into the cruiser early on July 30th. These caused catastrophic damage that capsized the cruiser in only 12 minutes. The fate of the crewmen who survived the sinking was tragic, as they spent 4 days in the water before being found and rescued. Of the 1,196 men aboard, only 316 survived. Indianapolis earned 10 battle stars. New Orleans-class design and construction. New Orleans-class was the second generation of American treaty cruisers. It was undoubtedly the best U.S. treaty cruiser and, overall, one of best-balanced treaty cruisers produced by any nation. The ships were the Portland class. The top profile is of Portland as she appeared during 1942. This shows a typical early war configuration before extensive modifications took place. The ship retains its large foremast, on top of which an SC radar has been fitted. The aft superstructure and mainmast also still remain. The anchor-craft fit has been strengthened and includes a pair of 1.1-inch quad mounts abreast the bridge and another pair located aft in the middle of the 5-inch secondary battery. At this point, only 1,220 mm guns were fitted. The ship is in the MiG-21 scheme. The next two profiles show Indianapolis in July 1945, just before her loss to submarine torpedoes. The ship has just received the state-of-the-art anti-aircraft modifications, which include an SK radar on the new lattice mast built around the aft stack. Note the mainmast has been removed. 6 40mm quad mounts, and 8 twin 20mm mounts. Much top weight, primarily the forward and aft superstructures, has been removed or reduced to allow these late war modifications. The arrangement of the main and secondary batteries is unaltered. The ship is the MiG-22 graded system scheme, which was designed to provide anti-submarine and anti-aircraft concealment. Much better designed than the earlier Northamptons because they used the full permitted 10,000 T. Originally, it was envisioned that 15 of these ships would be built, but this did not occur because of parsimony of Congress and the overall tonnage restrictions on heavy cruisers introduced by the London Naval Treaty of 1930. In the end, only 7 ships were built. The first 3 were from the 1929 budget, and the next 3 were funded in 1930, but the last ship in this group was not started until 1933. The London Naval Treaty prevented the final ship from being started until 1934. Because the construction of these ships was spread out over a number of years, there were actually 3 subgroups of ships with slight differences in appearance and armament. The key difference in this class was the design emphasis placed on protection. This was accomplished by converting the used 1,000 T into or more and also by reducing the hull by 14 feet at the waterline compared with the Portland class and the beam by some 4 feet. The reduction in the hull length was made possible by adopting a new arrangement in machinery spaces that reduced the length of each engine room by 4 feet. Of the design displacement, 15% was used for armor. The shorter hull meant the armor belt was shorter, and this weight saving was converted into additional thickness of the belt. The maximum belt thickness was increased to 5 and tapered to 3 inches on its lower part. The magazines received another 3 to 4.7 in of additional side protection internally. Deck protection was to 0.5 in over magazines and 1.1 to 5 in elsewhere. The turret barbette received 5 inches of armor and the conning tower to 0.5 inches. The turrets were much more heavily armored and made proof in some areas against 8 inches gunfire. Turret faces were protected with 8 in of armor, to 0.75 inches on the roof, and 1.5 inches on the sides and rear. The same machinery was fitted as on the Portland class. The principal difference was that the unit arrangement was not employed, which means that all boiler rooms were placed together forward of the engine rooms, creating the risk of all propulsive power being destroyed by a single well-placed torpedo. The class also had a reduced bunkerage, which meant that range was reduced to 7,600 nanometers. The provision of aircraft remained an important consideration. Aircraft arrangements were similar to those on the Portland class. Two catapults were 33 fitted, serviced by two cranes, and stowage space was available for 4 aircraft. Since the 2 funnels were placed forward, all of the aircraft handling facilities were abaft the aft stack. These were the best aircraft handling facilities of any preceding treaty cruiser, since the well deck and the hangar gave ample room for handling and stowage. There were subtle differences in appearance among the 7 ships. The first 3 ships had the top of their turret face rounded, and the last 4 featured a flat face. Most different was the signal bridge located above the navigation bridge, which was open on 3 ships and covered on the other 4. The last 2 ships built, Vincennes and Quincy, were of the same appearance, but differed from the rest of the class. They had flat faces on the 8 turrets, their signal bridges were open, and these were the only 2 ships that had their barbette for turret number 2 exposed. Since the forward turret was moved 9 feet back as a cost-saving measure to reduce the length of armor belt. Another minor difference was the placement of the 3rd and 4th pairs of 5-inch guns. Some were indented, and some were not. USS San Francisco. This is San Francisco as she appeared in November 1942, at the time of her being heavily damaged at the first naval battle off Guadalcanal. The cruiser was a member of the New Orleans class, which was the best of the American treaty cruiser designs. The view shows a New Orleans class cruiser in its early war configuration. The ship presents a much different appearance from earlier classes with the absence of the large tripod masts and the movement of the aircraft handling facilities to a position abaft the aft stack. The new style of 8-inch turrets is also evident. The radar fit consists of a single radar on the foremast, and the anti-aircraft fit is still not heavily augmented, consisting of only for 1.1 in quad mounts, located abreast the bridge and on the fantail, and 12 20mm single guns. The ship is in the MiS-11 scheme, which was very similar to the MiS-21 scheme. Armamente main battery remained 9 8-inch guns arranged in 3 triple turrets. These 7 ships in the class had 3 different types of 8-inch guns. From the onset, they were completed with a secondary battery of 8 single 5-inch 25 guns. Light anti-aircraft armament was restricted to 8.50 cal machine guns. Service modifications prior to the war, the 5-inch guns were provided with splinter shields. As soon as they were available, each ship received for 1.1 in quad mounts. These were mounted in pairs, one set above the navigation bridge and the second on the fantail. This was completed by April 1942. The machine guns were also replaced by single 20mm mounts as soon as possible. By 1942 the prescribed bed number was 12, and these were placed in groups on the forward superstructure, on top of the hangar, and on the aft superstructure. Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were all lost in this configuration. 3 of the surviving 4 ships had been seriously damaged in the Guadalcanal campaign, so when they returned to the U.S. for repair, they were also modernized. This changed their appearance markedly. Both the forward and aft superstructures were rebuilt. The new superstructures were more compact and lighter, and were slightly different on each of the 4 ships. This was important since the ships were already at the limit of their weight allowances. Any increase in anti-aircraft weaponry had to be compensated for 37 by the removal of other top weight. The new design also gave the new weapons greater arcs of fire. These allowed for a dramatic improvement off the anti-aircraft fit in 1943. The 1.1 in mounts were replaced by 40mm quad mounts, and another pair was added on top on the hangar, bringing the total to 6. The number of single 20mm mounts was also increased. This was accomplished primarily by altering the searchlight tower between the stacks and adding a platform around the aft stack. The table below gives us representative fits of the New Orleans class ships during various points in their wartime careers. Another weight-saving measure was to remove one-off catapults and to reduce the number of aircraft usually embarked to 2. Wartime service at 7 ships in this class had generally similar careers with the exception of Tuscaloosa. The other 6 were assigned to the Pacific Fleet and were active as carrier escorts in the first months of the war, until all were committed to the intense night battles off Guadalcanal. 3 of these ships were sunk in a single night during the opening battle of the campaign, with remaining 3 all being damaged later in the campaign. When the 3 surviving ships returned to service, they again returned to carrier escort duties. The lead ship, New Orleans, had a very active career seeing action in most major battles of the war. The ship was caught in Pearl Harbor during the Japanese attack but was undamaged. Assigned to carrier duty, she was present at both Coral Sea and Midway. She remained with the carriers into the Guadalcanal campaign and escorted Saratoga at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. On the night of November 30, she was one of 4 heavy cruisers torpedoed by Japanese destroyers. New Orleans took a single torpedo forward, which destroyed her bow as far back as the second turret, a total of 154 feet. Upon returning to service, she joined the fast carrier force and participated in the Gilberts and Marshall Scampings. During the massive raid on Truk in February, New Orleans was part of a surface task group deployed to catch Japanese ships escaping the air attack. She engaged and sank a Japanese training cruiser and a destroyer. In June, she was present at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. She remained with carriers at the Battle of Light Gulf, and was again part of a task group formed to finish off cripples from their attack. She finished off a light carrier and sank a large destroyer that went down with guns blazing. After Arafat, she returned in mid-April 1945 for the Okinawa campaign. Her extensive wartime service earned her 16 battle stars. New Orleans was placed in reserve in 1947 and sold for scrap in 1959. Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes had very similar fates and will be treated together. All began the war assigned to carrier escort duty. Astoria was present at Coral Sea and Midway, and Vincennes was also at Midway. On the night of Tuscaloosa at Cherbourg, by the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, only 2 treaty cruisers remained in the European theater. These ships were active on D-Day and later supported the American attack against the key port of Cherbourg on the Cotentin Peninsula. This scene depicts Tuscaloosa conducting a bombardment of German defenses at the port of Cherbourg on June 26, 1944. The cruiser successfully engaged German shore batteries and was not damaged. This view shows the cruiser in her late war configuration and camouflage. The ship has had its forward superstructure dude and mounts an SK radar in the foremast. 6 40mm quad mounts have been fitted, 1 pair abreast the bridge, 1 pair on top of the hangar, and the last on the fantail, and some 2,220mm single guns are evident. The ship is in the MiS 3313D scheme, which was a refinement of Father Dazzle schemes designed to give low visibility anti-submarine protection. August 8 to 9th, the 3 were covering the American invasion fleet of Guadalcanal. All were assigned to the Northern Force, which was attacked and surprised by a force of 5 Japanese heavy and 1 light cruiser. Within minutes of the opening off engagement, all 3 ships were devastated by deadly and accurate 8-in gunfire. Quincy was the first to sink, following 54 shell hits of various sizes and 3 torpedoes. 370 crewmen were killed. Vincennes was struck by as many as 74 shell hits and 2 torpedoes, suffering 330 killed. The Japanese cruisers hit Astoria with between 34 and 63 shells. 216 died aboard Astoria. The only effective reply was delivered by Quincy when she hit the bridge of the Japanese flagship with 2 8-inch shells, killing 34. Minneapolis recorded an outstanding wartime career, earning 17 battle stars in the process. She barely missed being present at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The cruiser was quickly assigned to carrier escort duty, participating in the raids in January and February 1942, and then taking part in the carrier battles of Coral Sea and Midway. The cruiser was also present at Eastern Solomons. The cruiser was one of the targets of Japanese torpedoes at Tassafaronga on November 30th. She survived the most damage to any New Orleans-class ship after taking to torpedoes. One blew off the bow up until forward 8 in turret, and the other hit aft and flooded a boiler room. Repairs took until September 1943. Upon returning to service, she rejoined the fast carrier force and participated in the Gilberts and Marshalls campaigns. Along with New Orleans, Minneapolis participated in the February 1944 raid on Truk and assisted in the sinking of a Japanese training cruiser and a destroyer attempting to escape their onslaught. The cruiser was present at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. For the light operation, she was assigned to the 7th Fleet, supporting ground troops with shore bombardments and taking part in the Battle of Surigao Strait on October 25. Minneapolis remained in the Philippines to take part in the invasion of Luzon in January 1945. In March and April, the cruiser participated in the preliminaries of the Okinawa invasion and the first weeks of the battle. A well-deserved refit meant the ship missed the last months of the war. With the return of peace, Minneapolis was placed in reserve in 1947 and then sold for scrap in 1959. San Francisco was the second most decorated ship in U.S. history after Carrier Enterprise. Her combat career, spent entirely in the Pacific, earned her 17 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation. The cruiser was undergoing refit in Pearl Harbor the day the war began, but she survived the raid undamaged. Like most other heavy cruisers, she was quickly assigned to carrier escort duty. Sent to the South Pacific. She participated in raids against Rabaul in January and against Japanese invasion forces off New Guinea in March. San Francisco missed Coral Sea and Midway, but was involved in the Guadalcanal campaign from the onset. The ship was present at the carrier battle of the Eastern Solomons in August, and during first American surface victory in October at the Battle of Cape Esperance. Later in October, she participated in the Battle of Santa Cruz, but saw no action. As the campaign entered its decisive phase in November, San Francisco was designated as the flagship of a cruiser-destroyer force to stop a Japanese bombardment of the airfield on Guadalcanal by 2 battleships. In the most fierce and confused night battle of the war, fought at close range, San Francisco scored a critical hit on battleship WWII, which wrecked her steering compartment and began a chain of events that led to her loss. San Francisco was in the midst of the action and was hit by shells from both sides. At least 45 shells struck the ship, killing her captain, the embarked admiral, and many crewmen. The badly damaged cruiser survived and returned to the U.S. for repair, which took until February 1943. Upon her return, the cruiser took part in the reoccupation of Attu and Kiska and the Aleutians. By November, San Francisco returned to the Central Pacific to take part in the Gilberts and Marshalls campaigns. Throughout 1944, the cruiser remained with the fast carrier force, taking part in the Hollandia operation and then the Philippine Sea action in June. She missed Light Gulf because of refit, but returned to take part in the 1945 operations in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and finally Okinawa. She returned to the U.S. in early 1947 and entered a reserve status before being sold for scrap in 1959. Tuscaloosa was the only New Orleans-class ship to spend the majority of her career in the European theater. The beginning of war found Tuscaloosa on neutrality patrol in the North Atlantic. From April until September 1942, the cruiser was attached to the British Home Fleet, which included duty on the Arctic convoy route. In November 1942, she was assigned to escort the Casablanca invasion convoy in Operation Torch through the light invasion of French North Africa. During this operation, she engaged and damaged a French destroyer and dodged French submarine torpedoes. In September 1943, Tuscaloosa escorted Carrier Ranger during strikes on German shipping in Norwegian waters. In June, she provided gunfire support to American forces at Udall Beach during the Normandy invasion. In July, she dueled with German shore batteries off Cherbourg. In August, in her final operation in European waters, Tuscaloosa supported the invasion of southern France. Arriving in the Pacific in January 1945, she participated in the invasion of Iwo Jima the following month, and then took part in the preliminaries of the Okinawa invasion in March 1945. Her war time service gained her 7 battle stars. That cruiser was placed in reserve in 1946 and sold for scrap in 1959. For two Wichita-class design and construction, which it was originally intended as the 8th New Orleans-class ship, but this was altered by the London Naval Treaty. In accordance with the treaty, the final New Orleans-class ship was laid down in 1934. The last of 18 heavy cruisers would be started in 1935, but by that time the USN already had in hand a very successful 10,000 light cruiser design, the Brooklyn class, which was armed with 15 6-inch guns. In several respects, this was a more advanced design than the treaty heavy cruiser, so it was decided to use the design as the basis for the final USN treaty heavy cruiser. After issues were resolved on fitting the 8-inch gun battery onto a light cruiser hull, construction was begun in late 1935. The new design featured several important improvements. These included a better secondary battery layout, improved placement of aircraft handling facilities, a higher freeboard for better seakeeping, and greater range created by more bunkerage. The ships were also the best protected of the American treaty cruisers. This ship had the least design margin in terms of overall weight, so excessive topside weight was an issue for her entire life. After sea trials, more ballasting was added to address this issue. Machinery was comparable to the New Orleans class but with the substitution of Parsons geared turbines. These developed 100,000 St. Helena pounds, which was sufficient to propel the ship at a top speed of over 33 knots. Protection was better than that of the New Orleans class. The main belt was 4 inches on the ends and a maximum of 6 inches with 2 to 5 inches of horizontal protection. The turret barbets were covered by 7 inches of armor and the conning tower by 6 inches. For the first time on an American cruiser, the aircraft handling facilities were moved from their customary position amidships to the ship's fantail. This was a major improvement since it removed a major source of battle damage from fire to the less vulnerable rear of the ship. It also provided better arcs than New Orleans and Wichita-class Minneapolis is shown in her late war configuration October 1944 at Light Gulf in the first two profiles. As opposed to early war New Orleans-class ships, the forward superstructure has been reduced and an SK radar placed on the foremast. The 1.1-inch quad mounts have been replaced by 14 quads, and another pair added on top of the hangar. Up to 25 single 20mm mounts can be seen, many in the reworked area between the two stacks. The ship is wearing unique camouflage chemise 8, which was intended to make the cruiser look like a two-stack destroyer. Note Naval's life raft and shear line. The stacks are also being made to look smaller with shading, and other parts of the ship were dappled to break up their lines. The third profile is Wichita, which had a unique appearance among all treaty-heavy cruisers. The two stacks are tightly spaced together and the aircraft handling facilities have been moved to the fantail, as is evident by the placement of the catapults and crane. Note the placement of the secondary battery is also much different, with 2 mounts placed on the center line fore and aft of the superstructure. The 8-inch turrets are also of a different design. Wichita provided the template for all subsequent US and heavy cruiser designs. The ship is an MS-22 graded system, which was preferred late in the war since it proved a deception against air and submarine observation armament. The armament of the new class was also substantially enhanced. The main battery remained the customary 9 8-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, but the guns were placed in new mountings. This turret featured a greater separation off the gun barrels, which corrected the problem with dispersion. The turret was also heavily armored with 8 inches of face armor, 3.75 inches on the sides and 2.75 inches on the roof. The mounting also featured better training and elevating speeds. The main battery was supported by 2 advanced Mk-30 for fire control directors. For the secondary battery, the move was made from the cruiser's standard 5-25 gun to the newer 5 inches 38 gun. This had already proved successful on destroyers and carriers, and would become generally considered as the best dual-purpose weapon of the war. The gun had a greater range and a better rate of fire than the older 5 inches guns. The layout of the secondary armament was also enhanced with 2 of the guns placed on the center line, which provided fore and aft coverage. Because of top weight considerations, the 5 guns were placed in single, not twin, mounts. These were the Mk-35 in mounts unique to Wichita. 4 of these were enclosed, marking the first time an American cruiser received an enclosed 5 mount. 2 Mk-33 directors supported the 5 inches battery. Wichita was completed with the total inadequate light anti-aircraft armament of only 8.50 cal machine guns. Service modifications. Wichita's first modifications were to increase the ship's anti-aircraft fit. By 1942, 2 quad 1.1 mounts were added, and the machine guns replaced by 20mm single guns. The number of 20 guns increased to 22 by 1944, but was lowered to 18 in 1945 as top weight became critical. In late 1943, she underwent a 3-month overhaul in Bremerton. During this period, her appearance was altered by the construction of for 5 a smaller forward superstructure to reduce top weight and to provide better arcs of fire for the much increased anti-aircraft suite. In addition to the 20 single mounts, for quad 40mm and to twin 40mm mounts were included. The radar suite was also extensively upgraded. Later in the war, 2 further twin 40mm mounts were added on the stern in response to the kamikaze threat. Wartime service. Wichita was one of the few American heavy cruisers to see significant service in both the European and Pacific theaters. For this service, she received 13 battle stars. The beginning of hostilities found Wichita in Iceland. She remained in the Atlantic and joined the home fleet in April 1942. She operated under British command and provided cover for convoys PQ-15 and -16 to northern Russia. The next convoy, PQ-17, was savaged by German air and submarine attack in early July, after Wichita and the other covering units were ordered to withdraw. Her next operation was as part of the invasion of North Africa. On November 8, she dueled with French shore batteries and suffered a single 194mm hit that wounded 14 men but caused no serious damage. Later that same day, Wichita engaged a French light cruiser and narrowly avoided torpedoes from a French submarine. In early 1943, Wichita was sent to the Pacific. Her first action was at the Battle of Rennell Island on January 29. Wichita was hit by an air-launched torpedo, but the weapon was a dud. The cruiser moved into the northern Pacific to participate in the reoccupation of Kiska and Attu in the Aleutians. In January 1944, she was assigned to the Fast Carrier Force and participated in the Marshall Islands campaign and the truck raid in February. She continued to screen the carriers through the battles of the Philippine Sea and Light Gulf. At Light, she and New Orleans finished off a crippled Japanese light carrier and a destroyer on October 25. She was heavily engaged at Okinawa in 1945, where she fought both Japanese aircraft and shore batteries. After the war, she was placed in reserve in 1946 and sold for scrap in 1959. Analysis and conclusion. The first generation of U.S. and treaty cruisers were generally regarded as unsuccessful designs, especially in comparison with their Japanese contemporaries. The second class of first-generation ships, the Northampton class, featured incremental improvements, but the ships were still underweight and inadequately protected. Once American deciders realized that they had an extra 1,000 t to work with, the second generation of treaty cruisers were much improved and proved to be formidable ships. These were balanced designs that were much better protected, while still maintaining a heavy armament. The Wichita class was a mostly successful prototype for subsequent cruiser designs. The new 8-in turret proved effective and was standard on the very successful Baltimore class that followed. The layout of the secondary armament was much better, but still the design was constrained by the overall tonnage limitation. The main problems of this design, trying to jam too much onto the small hull and inadequate secondary armament, were not remedied until designers were freed from tonnage limitations. The result was the Baltimore class, which produced easily the most powerful heavy cruisers of the war. The war record of U.S. and treaty cruisers presents a mixed picture. This was particularly true of the supposedly better protected New Orleans class, which saw 3 ships sunk in a single night. In this case, the destruction of these ships was not due to any design problem, but to a general lack of battle readiness shared by all U.S. ships at this point in the war. Each of 3 ships was subjected to a storm of accurate 8 inches shell fire from fairly close range that no cruiser could have survived. 2 of the ships were also torpedoed, ensuring their destruction. The remaining New Orleans-class ships served throughout the war in a number of roles and were highly successful. On occasion, they showed themselves able to take considerable damage and survive. The primary shortcoming levied against U.S. and treaty cruisers was indeed their inability to take damage and survive. This seems overblown since, in most instances where a ship was lost, the level of damage would have been fatal to any cruiser. Of the 7 ships sunk, 5 fell into this category. The other 2 succumbed to torpedoes, whereas on another occasion 2 torpedoes in fact failed to sink a treaty cruiser. These ships survived significant damage a number of times. The table below lays out all instances of severe damage suffered by treaty cruisers during the war.